Welcome to Naked Reflections, brought to you from the Wolf Institute. I'm Ed Kessler, and each week I'll be taking an in-depth look at the stories reported by our friends over at the Naked Scientists. What does the latest scientific stuff mean for the rest of us? Stay with us and find out. Hello and welcome to Naked Reflections. It's widely agreed that the asylum system in the UK is not working, with damaging effects across society, not just for asylum seekers and refugees. The previous Home Secretary even admitted it was broken. And this is the reason why a new independent commission on the integration of refugees has been convened by the Wolf Institute and is being launched this week. It will spend the next 18 months consulting with asylum seekers, refugees, third sector workers, lawyers, health clinicians, yes, on and on I could go, as well as politicians and policymakers. Why? In order to seek improvements to the refugee and asylum system and to offer practical solutions. It sounded like such a good idea that this edition of Naked Reflections will consider how, in what has become a febrile environment, a broken asylum system can be fixed. But is it realistic to find common ground in such a toxic atmosphere? Is it even possible for everyone, not only refugees, to feel welcome and integrated? And does doing the right thing for refugees mean that wider society loses? I'd like to think this isn't a zero-sum game, and here's Lieselot Linkso taking an upbeat view on the Naked Scientist show, Life in the Year 2100.
If you look out of the window right now, we have refugee crisis, we have environmental crisis, we have so many people who need a better quality of life. We don't have enough water. There is so many jobs out there. So I think it's so sad to look at these young people who are scared of entering the labor market because they hear the robots are coming and they won't be needed. You know, they are needed like never before, but it's a different kind of perspective. New jobs are going to be created.
With me to discuss the asylum system and the integration of refugees are two of its distinguished commissioners. Jahangir Malik from Birmingham, Director of Policy and Engagement at Mercy Mission UK, who has wide experience in civil society and faith-based leadership. Joining Jahangir is Janice Lopatkin, UK Programme Director of the World Jewish Relief, who's also Chair of Trustees of the Refugee Employment Network. Welcome both. Jahangir, there are many factors underpinning the successful integration of refugees. What would you think is the most important?
Fundamentally, I think the framing of the understanding of refugees and asylum seekers as human beings, as people of dignity, as people just like ourselves that we can relate to on an everyday level is a really critical way of understanding. I think this toxic nature of the way people fleeing from floods, war, climate change, conflict. I've been a humanitarian for pretty much of my life and seen sort of what they are fleeing from in disasters and war zones and conflict. And it really does take a huge amount for them to leave such circumstances and then to arrive on our shores here. We continue our long tradition. My parents came as economic migrants in the 60s, faced very difficult times in the 70s. So I think that really integrating refugees and asylum seekers into our system, providing them an understanding of UK life, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, being productive within the society, I think will enable them to have a better understanding of UK life and some things as simple as language.
He also touched on something which I would like to tease out because I've struggled with this, Jahangir, which is the difference, and I think there is a difference between economic migrants, you mentioned your parents as economic migrants, and refugees and asylum seekers. And we're struggling with this on the Commission. Maybe struggle is not quite the right word, grappling with this on the Commission, because there is a difference, and I don't know how we unpack it. Now, there are you as a community and faith leader in Birmingham, where the Commission is being launched, actually, and there's a large community of economic migrants, first generation, second generation, like yourself. But there's a difference, isn't there, between the two categories? And we need to tease that out because it gets confused, doesn't it?
I know it's not the same, but they did not stop working. They worked damn hard right throughout day and night, almost 7 days a week, to ensure that they were being productive, that they were providing, and that they were not sitting idly.
Something that can make a significant difference is employment, because it is both integration for the employer, the community, but also integration, obviously, for refugees. And in addition, importantly, it gives people, in terms of the work and the employment, it has to be decent work and it has to be suitable and it has to be sustainable. These are people looking for work. These are people who want to work, but people don't necessarily, if they've worked in the Bank of Ukraine as a board member, do not want to be offered cleaning jobs. They need to be able to find suitable and sustainable work. So I'm not suggesting that any work will provide a whole range of integration support around it. It won't necessarily, and we have to be quite discerning and supportive. There are a full range of jobs that can offer you the opportunity to meet people, be part of your community, to practice your English, to use your skills, to use your qualifications and your experience. And I think it's all about giving people dignity and dignity to rebuild their lives. You know, people, because of their circumstance, have had to move, and suddenly everything they've done before is considered to be not necessarily relevant.
We have a fundamental issue at this moment in time of employment and a labour shortage. Now, you will not fix that labour shortage by framing the debate in the current context of good migrant, bad migrant, good economic migrants that we need and help us rebuild our country, which I guess was the case in the 50s and the 60s, and now bad refugees and asylum seekers that are coming in that we do not want in this place. And so if we frame the debate as, you know, people that we welcome into the country and people that we don't welcome into the country, that's not going to be a healthy way of looking at the current situation. Over the last 25 years, I've been involved in various humanitarian crises around the world, and sadly, a lot of the movement of people and the migration is due to the wars and the conflicts occurring at horrific levels in various parts of the world, from Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq. I have worked in these settings, and the vast majority of the refugees are settling in neighboring countries. The absolute overwhelming majority settle in Turkey, in Lebanon, and the likes. And the very few that are able to make way across the lands into mainland Europe and into the UK. The question I would like to ask is, that kind of nation do we want to be? And what kind of understanding and welcome kind of nation do we want to be when people who've fled desperate situation arrive onto our shores?
It's a funny contradiction, isn't it? Or is it a contradiction? You know, political commentary has revolved around preventing this rapid increase in the number of boat crossings. I mean, it's all over the news. Politicians are all talking about it. And yet, in comparison with the million Syrians in Jordan, for example, and the 5 million Syrians in Turkey, those neighbouring countries, we have 20,000 or so in the UK. You mentioned your parents. Both my parents came as refugees before the war from Austria, fleeing the Nazis. And throughout the 20th century, the British public has shown itself to be generous in welcoming refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people. So there's a funny old contradiction there, isn't there?
I think it's perception rather than toxic. I think it's a perception that people fall into, that if you're a refugee, and that can often be, you know, you have no agency, you have no qualifications, and even if you do have them, they're not transferable here. I think it's lack of knowledge, and us promoting and really celebrating the skills and experience that refugees have and have always had when coming to the UK. This is not new. This is something that we know a range of communities have brought to the UK, and we often do celebrate. I think what's toxic is the image of a refugee and the image of an asylum seeker. It's not really the reality of what people bring. I think there is a bit of a split around perception and maybe some of the views that we may have in the media about people coming over. and seeking asylum and questioning that, to actually the reality when people are meeting, working, supporting refugees. Money is being spent, and rightly, to support asylum seekers, but it's not doing a very good job. It's too little. People want to work, they want to be active whilst they wait to go through the asylum process. And actually, we will be solving so many issues as we go through the system, because all you're doing is you're piling up and causing more mental health issues, family issues, where actually people could be working. There could be a process where there is work. I mean, even now, some asylum seekers can work. Well, I don't really see why some can on a very long list of selected professions. It just doesn't make any sense. You need the will to do it. You need the will to allow people to be self-sufficient. And actually, in most other countries, asylum seekers are allowed to work. And in fact, asylum seekers were allowed to work in the UK maybe 20 years ago. It's political. And I think we need to recognise that. And we need to be able to put some really sensible processes and policies in place for asylum seekers to work.
You were right, because it was under the Labour government, interestingly enough, that asylum seekers were taken off, as it were, the right to work. Could you briefly summarise what the law is at the moment?
Well, you are not allowed to work until you get your refugee status, or you're indefinite leave to remain. You are not allowed to work as an asylum seeker. There are some professions where an asylum seeker can work for a limited amount of time, but it is restrictive. It is aimed to be restrictive. That's a punitive system. It doesn't support people fleeing and looking for sanctuary in the UK. And actually, everyone understands the rule of law and that you have to go through a legal process. That legal process is too long. You know, if people are here, we've got a crisis at the moment in terms of employment. I know there are various predictions into the future, but I can assure you now, people are looking for staff. They cannot find the staff. And actually, if you said to an asylum seeker for 6 months or a year, or whilst you go through your process, you will be able to work, I think that's a win-win for everybody.
This is Naked Reflections with me, Ed Kessler. To mark the launch of the UK Commission on the Integration of Refugees, I'm discussing the asylum system with two of its commissioners, Jahangir Malik and Janice Lopatkin. We're all happy to see the relatively generous European response to Ukrainian refugees in the UK and throughout Europe. But there is a nagging feeling that Syrians fleeing the civil war a few years earlier were not so warmly welcomed. Here's the sociologist Grace Davies' observations on the Naked Reflection show, Believing and Belonging.
All over Europe, I'm beginning to see new configurations that worry me considerably. It comes in different forms in different places, but the common theme is the dominant religion, which is Christian in Europe. I mean, the more belief drops out of it, the more that you are losing belief or becoming more secular. It's laying itself open to be used negatively, in other words, as a bulwark against mostly Islam.
So Jahangir, Grace expressed some anxiety. I think there's sort of tension between what's often perceived as Christian Europe with the Muslim East. And you and I both know this is not only simplistic, but also false. But nevertheless, in some parts of Europe, I'm thinking of Hungary and Poland, for example, there's a great emphasis on national identity being associated with Christian identity. Do you think there was a difference in the way that we, in general, treated Syrian refugees in comparison with Ukrainians, or is that overblown in the sort of media hype that we live in today?
You know, a human life is a human life, and anybody fleeing war and conflict should be recognized that they are in desperate, difficult circumstances. And, you know, I come back to my faith teachings on this one, and anyone, you know, a verse in the Holy Quran that's driven my own sort of humanitarian ethos is that anyone save a life is like saving the life of whole of mankind. Now, that life may be irrespective of where it's coming from. You know, it's of great value that we play an important role. However, we certainly observed a difference in the way that Ukraine refugees were perceived and welcomed, and policy changes were brought into effect, which enabled us to demonstrate once again, I think, the ethos of what we're saying, that society, community, with even its really challenging circumstances of um, austerity and cost of living crisis, we still have room in our hearts and in our homes for refugees when there is a demonstration of political will. And I'd never think that really that economic circumstances are so bad that we can't really help anybody else. And there was a clear distinction in which the way that Ukraine refugees were welcomed as opposed to refugees from other parts of the land, especially in Syria. And I was reflecting the change in policy when this 2-year-old child was washed upon the shore, Alan Kurdi. That marked it. I really hope and pray that it doesn't take a child being washed upon our shore to change policy, which embarrasses the nation.
Yes, there's a sense of embarrassment, but also I think in the Syria context, it was complicated. It was a complicated war. It was a civil war between different parties. And it wasn't as obvious, if you like, as the Russia-Ukrainian war, where there seems to be a clearer dichotomy between the oppressor and the oppressed. And it was that moment, I think you're right, Jahangir, it was that moment of the terrible image of that child being washed up on the shore. And that went around the world, and it triggered this enormous wave of emotion. And you know, having worked in humanitarian aid for so many years, it does take some images of a terrible earthquake in Pakistan, for example, that comes around the world, and then people react in an incredibly generous way. I'm also hoping that we will tackle difficult issues, you know. I know we will, because we haven't touched today on questions of capacity, and on another podcast we will, but let's take one of them, which is the actual processing, and I know it's a very difficult word, processing, but the handling of refugees. And I'm thinking this government's policy is to send some to Rwanda, right? And I know what your view is of that, and I know my view, but I want to ask about the point underneath it, which is there an argument that we should be processing refugees, assessing them outside the UK? So in the Ukraine, for example, I know that the Foreign Office set up desks in Poland, for example, to facilitate the move to the UK. So David Goodhart, one of our commissioners, is vociferous in saying we do need to process refugees and the asylum process outside the UK, because all these illegal spontaneous arrivals are hugely dangerous for the people concerned, as well as hugely difficult to handle on the shores of Kent. Do you understand that?
I think we come back to the fundamental point, Ed. There has to be political will. We have to frame an understanding that what we're talking about are human beings who are fleeing war and conflict. And whatever is the best and most productive or most humane way of administering the system, I think we have a rich history of having demonstrated the ability to be able to do that. Now, what's the best way to do that in this current set of circumstances? Well, we're going to embark upon that conversation. What the experts around the table with their various views at the local level, what that means. Now, we know at the moment, accommodation, housing, hotels, and the likes within the UK is a really problematic system. I was involved with when the Afghan refugees arrived after the change administration, and that was a really challenging one to ensure that the administration process worked. However, and we'll be unpacking some of this. Other countries in Europe have done this, United States and Canada, so there's lots of learning examples.
So my hope is that we actually are able to put forward something that will make a tangible difference, that it's not a paper that gets put to one side and it's something that's great to quote from. I really think if we can put together something that makes a policy difference, you know, there are some really obvious things that I would like us to be able to talk about and to be maybe move forward, which is around asylum seekers who are currently in hotels around the country. They are often in the asylum system for 1 to 3 years, and they're not allowed to work, and they live on £8 a week.
I wonder whether we can move on from, if you like, public perceptions. You're one of the commissioners. You've been at the heart of the launch in Birmingham, where we've engaged with politicians, and we've engaged with refugees, and we've engaged with those agencies working in the area. And we're doing that all around the country, in not just in Birmingham, but in Newcastle, in Glasgow, in Greater Manchester, in Cardiff, in London, as well as national hearings. And, dear listener, we will be issuing a call for evidence, which you'll hear more about just at the end. But, Jahangir, how hopeful are you that the Commission can actually make a practical difference? Because one of the things I'm excited about is we've brought together these conflicting views. We've brought together the advocates, the agencies, English Refugee Council, Scottish Refugee Council. We have it co-produced with refugees from Rwanda and other parts of the world. We have pretty diverse political opinion, and over the next 18 months we'll be sharing the views of other commissioners than yourself. But what's your hope? What do you want from this commission?
Very much hoping that we can have a safe space in which that we can have divergent views come to the table, and that we can have hate to use this word, Ed, but a mature conversation, an honest conversation, an open conversation, a conversation which does not have to have headline grabbing, so sensationalization of a really tough debate, of a tough issue, but that we can have it around the table in a way that will enable us to hear the views of lived experience. So I'm really hopeful and hopeful that we will be able to facilitate, convene conversation, have rich input of lived experiences, and not one stating that which side of the camp are you in. Are you against or for refugees and asylums? And I don't think it is an against and a for refugee asylum. It is a ever-present reality that's not changing. And so therefore, we're hoping as commissioners and as a part of the commission that will enable time, space for having these conversations.
There's so much more to discuss, but our time is up. The Commission for the Integration of Refugees will be continuing its work until the end of next year, and I expect we'll be hearing more about that. You can follow its progress on the Commission website, which is refugeeintegrationuk.com. And if you fancy, dear listener, please respond to the call for evidence, which is being issued next month. Many thanks to my guests, Jahangir Malik and Janice Lopatkin, and good luck with your work. And thanks to you too for listening. If you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, you might want to browse our archive of podcasts, which includes a fascinating discussion about the meaning of sanctuary. And feel free to check out other podcasts from the Woolf Institute or from our friends at the Naked Scientists. I'll be back next week with some more guests.